Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Brad Blitz. I'm a professor here and I'm head of IOE's Department of Education, Practice and Society. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event on IOE's 120-year history, which is being hosted by our department as part of IOE's 120th anniversary celebrations. Now, since the 1970s, IOE has been the leading centre for the history of higher education, the history of education in the UK. And pivotal to that was Professor Richard Aldridge, who was appointed to a lectureship here in IOE in 1973. And in his 30 years with us, he became one of the foremost historians of education of his generation. Now, sadly, Richard died in 2014. But among his many contributions, he authored the IOE's Centenary History, 1902 to 2002. Described as magisterial and definitive, unusually for such a publication, it was shortlisted for a national prize. And it was, in fact, the History of Education Society Book Prize. And indeed, it's not just a house history, it's also a history of teacher education and higher education. Richard deftly shows us how IOE shaped and was shaped by the national educational system as well as the country's international history. And the latter is something that colleagues in my department and another part of my department, the Centre for Education and International Development, will be publishing on later this year. It was another historian by training, the late Professor Jeff Whitty, a former director of IOE, who facilitated the updating of Richard Aldridge's history of IOE. And he did so to cover the year since 2002. And since then, Professor Tom Wooden took up the mantle, and working with other IOE colleagues who will be speaking today. Tom has achieved a seamless addition to the original volume, and I want to congratulate him and his team for that. But I will leave our speakers to say more over the course of this afternoon's discussion, which will draw out IOE's history and the wider history of education over the past 120 years. So let me first briefly introduce the speakers. And I'm very proud to call them my colleagues. So first of all, Tom Wooden, Professor of the Social History of Education here at IOE, whose research interests include the history of learning and learners, compulsory education, working class culture, and cooperation and mutuality. His recent publications include Working Class Writing and Publishing in the Late 20th Century. And with Professor Gary McCulloch and Steve Cowan, two edited collections on learning for a cooperative world. Professor Gary McCulloch is Brian Simon Chair of History of Education. He probably needs no introduction here. But Gary's recent publications have covered the history of educational studies and research. A past president of the British Educational Research Association, Gary is also the editor of the 6-volume Bloomsbury book series, A Cultural History of Education. And Dr. Georgina Brewis, Associate Professor in the History of Education, who is a historian of student culture, higher education, voluntary action, and humanitarianism. And just last year, she published Transformational Moments in Social Welfare, What Role for Voluntary Action? In the lead-up to UCL's bicentenary in 2026, Georgina is currently charting 200 years of student life in London. So with that, I will hand over to Tom, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Very rarely do I have notes for a talk. I'm used to cracking a few jokes, pressing this button, it's not working. I'm used to that, there you go. And talking away, and then as you run out of time, speed up very quickly. Hopefully that won't happen today, and I'll actually and roughly say what I'd like to say. It's very rare that you can start a talk like this by giving something away. It was nice to that's free, that you can download the book that we're celebrating today on open access at UCL Press. So please do take advantage of that. If you'd like to email me, my email's up there, but you can just search me, and happy to keep the discussion going. And I'm hoping to throw open a few discussion points today. My role was mainly around updating Richard's volume, the centenary. As Brad said, it was shortlisted for a prize, which is very rare for these kinds of institutional histories. Very rare indeed. They're often seen as a little bit anodyne, not so critical, don't always engage with the wider historical context. And so this is perhaps slightly different kind of task. And I added 2 core chapters to that. In addition, the thing I liked about Richard's volume is that it tells a story based upon evidence rather than imposing fixed categories, which was quite nice, and so it gave me some flexibility there. He aimed to link the external context with the internal changes at the Institute, and again, I tried to keep with that kind of model that he kept to. I have to turn around here because I thought I'd have the slides here, but I don't, so there's a mixture of notes and slides. So as I said, sometimes there is this assumption that that these volumes lack criticality, and certainly pressures as you write these kinds of these kinds of works that you're writing about somewhere you work at, very close to it, and also something you're very committed to. You know, hopefully you wouldn't work here if you weren't committed to it. Occasionally that happens, but not here, I don't think. I mean, occasionally it happens in wider public life, but I don't see it here. I should add. Of course, the title itself does correspond to some of these narratives of growth and progress, which have been problematized by others. The acorn to oak narrative that's contained in the title, From Training College to Global Institution. But I hope it's not anodyne, but aims to reveal some of the tensions and contradictions, highlight some of the changing context to which the IOE had to respond. Clearly the merger is a key element in this narrative that you can't escape from. It's the first thing you think of when you think of the years from the turn of the 21st century to 2020. And certainly the Institute, again, has prospered and grown since it merged with UCL. So again, that story of kind of growth and progress being a very powerful one. At the same time, I found it interesting to note that when I spoke to people about these experiences of the last 20 years, people were the context was rapidly changing. Whilst it's a dominant factor of the period representing a historic change, after some teething problems, of course, it rapidly became a new normal, as they say. So the memories of the IOE are sometimes friendlier or smaller or occasionally more democratic, but then people questioned whether it really was, you know, and whether those debates are still going on today, whether it was new or not. And so, in addition to that, another thing that prized open different perspectives on the history of the Institute was the memory of individual directors, for instance, who could be quite varied and caught up in what some have called, as we know, every narrative, some people argue, corresponds to, is the same as Star Wars, you know, the kind of Star Wars narrative, if you like, that a set of good people, they come together, they face a series of problems that through fortitude and creativity they overcome. And if I can shove another metaphor in there, they create a new Jerusalem, you know, that then creates further problems, of course. But of course, each director, you know, to do that needs to think about the gaps and the problems in earlier periods, how things have changed, problems that need fixing. So for instance, you know, Jeff Whitty, just one example of this, employed a respected consultant, Quentin Thompson, to tell the Institute that in fact he thought it had become a little bit too complacent. And that gave Jeff something to kind of work from and to bring about some of the changes that he favoured. So that's a continual kind of narrative, and that it's not just fixed stories of progress. There are different and conflicting and contested stories involved in that. You can tell I'm not the best sort of techie. But one thing we can't deny, this whole period of the 21st century has been highly eventful for the world of higher education. It comes after the end of the Cold War, in which market democracy and globalisation are seen as key themes. Universities have been under intense pressures. Michael Barber, an ex-IOE member of staff, wrote a report for the IPPR with others. An avalanche is coming. His version did not have a question mark, as mine does. New forms of flexibility were required, he argued, from institutions that were increasingly set in their ways. Stefan Collini highlighted how the whole ecology of higher education in Britain has been transformed in the past generation. Our own Ron Barnett warned of universities facing super complexity, in which there's a growing space between the idea and the reality of institutional practice. And so the IOE faces this dilemma of being very broadly committed to social justice, but at the same time trying to deliver this through a system of HE based upon hierarchies, which is inherently problematic. We'll get there. I think the second time it gets there. So I'm going to pick on just three examples really in the short time I have to think about key developments in the last 20 years and then try and locate those in a slightly broader historical context, as well as just a minor task to look to the future for a little bit and just to say these issues are not necessary. Some issues have gone away and others haven't. So the book outlines the key arguments, which I'm not going to repeat here, and developments leading up to the merger. It had been a simmering possibility, but the balance of forces made it unlikely or impractical at different times in the last 20 years. The IOE was increasingly exposed financially and couldn't build up the reserves it wanted that were considered essential for good practice of a university. London University was weakening its hold. This story may be quite familiar to many of you, upon its constituent colleges. Funding had increasingly been directed directly through the colleges, and in turn they were developing their own degree awarding powers. In a world dominated by the league table that we're all very familiar with today, the IOE lacked visibility, and it struggled, for instance, with international funding bodies for students who wanted to get grants from, they said, what is this institute? We don't know what an institute is. So these stories kept coming through to the institute. And so clearly since the merger, the IOE continued to grow. It gained more visibility and continued to perform very well in those league tables. And it's a fact of life in many ways, and there's minimal discussion really about the nature of the merger now. But one thing that perhaps is an issue for the future is just to think about how the continual, and it's an internal perspective in a way here, how the continual restructures of the past. I mean, Richard used to say that we get a restructure every 3 or 4 years. Thankfully, we haven't had any since the merger, and we've got these 6 departments that are very clear, but it's very problematic for a large institute like as this place is, where everyone works with everybody else to some extent, about how you divide and separate people up. And so IOE has settled on 6 departments, as I think Andrew and others told me, that the IOE has a very quite a strong faculty-based structure, as the rest of UCL perhaps is more based on departments, and I think that may be another issue that we face going forwards. But looking more outwards, I think the merger also helped the IOE to cement its position as a world-leading institution in education and in higher education. And in doing so, it highlighted both its London location and its global significance. And the place and space, I think, is a theme that is going to repeat itself in the coming years. So the recent period was marked by a significant growing contribution to regional development in and around the capital, but mainly a significant trends towards the globalisation of higher education. The IOE's priority from the early 2000s was to extend its global reach, although in reality it was quite prudent in the way it did that, through partnerships with universities in Singapore, China and elsewhere, through joint projects, seminars, increasing work in international development, helping to establish what became the international network of educational institutes, crucially by attracting students and researchers from across the globe. And again, I think there's a long history of development here. This period of globalisation is not entirely new. From the outset, the London Day Training College and the IOE trained teachers for London in particular, but it had also been placed within a nexus comprising local, regional, national and international relations, right from the outset, I think. So the recent period of globalisation, as I said, is not entirely unique. Gary's going to talk a bit about Fred Clark, and Fred Clark himself travelled widely across the empire in the 1930s, and the establishment of the IOE in the 1930s was very significant, significantly located within international developments, and there were kind of connections, and the model of Teachers College Columbia was kind of held up, and there was international funding. So it's quite a new, it's not a new development perhaps, this. And so looking forward, I think, the IOE will have to justify its position in relation to space and place in a world concerned very much with climate and inequality, among other things. Yeah? Like wine, art and food, students, researchers and ideas, I think, will have to be located in relation to their origins, purposes and connections. This may relate to the IOE's role in supporting social justice in London, for instance, and also supporting students. It may also relate to internationalisation and debates about decolonising the curriculum. It will also, of course, deal with controversial issues in the past, not least work on eugenics by Cyril Burt and others. And that brings me to the third theme. Press it twice. Third time lucky? Yeah. The third theme of research. And so the years from 2002 to 2008 witnessed a remarkable growth in the IOE, from a turnover of around 30 million to 70 million, from about 30 professors to over 80. This was achieved by taking advantage of favourable funding and political changes, and led to growth in a number of areas, not least the British cohort studies, the health-related research of the Thomas Coram Research Institute, or the comparative research of the Lake Centre. So the strapline, education and social research, was then added to indicate the way that the IOE was embracing research in its broadest sense. These good times, they never do they? Didn't last forever. Surprisingly, this new size, was in fact sustained throughout the whole period. So then after the 2007 to 2008 recession, which I think will turn out to be a very significant historical marker, and as well as the coalition government from 2010, which all made life much more difficult for the Institute and restricted funding and opportunities. So threats to the foundation disciplines of sociology, philosophy and history, thankfully, were averted. There are also debates over what one academic characterised as paradigm wars, with some worrying whether the IOE had become too close to policy, carrying out instrumental research on what works. And this was intensified with the reduction in funding for innovative research. Whitty himself was concerned about this, but of course also very happy to receive the funding that the research provided. So these trends and contradictions are likely to continue. In facing an uncertain future, keeping alive multiple strands of research may prove essential. In particular, critical, independent, theoretical and empirical research will continue to be a source of new ideas, as well as provide a critique of the way things are currently done. And we should perhaps recall that the origins of the term social science lay with the Owenites in the 1820s, who contrasted it rather with the dismal science, as they called it, of political economy, and emphasised the need for really useful knowledge that might help in individual and collective liberation. So to conclude, I'd emphasise the importance of this open-ended critical research as a central theme of humanity. Roy Lowe, who is here today, with his colleague Yoshihito Yasuhara, I hope I pronounced that right, their survey of the origins of higher learning report that from the inception of HE, the thirst for knowledge has been a constant theme. In doing so, the IOE is striving for continuity in some respects, of building up spaces for research, teaching and collaborations to advance our understanding of the practice of education. Charting these continuities is a difficult process at a time of intensifying social change. Having said this, we're all very much aware, I think, of how sudden social changes in the economy, environment and health can induce very sudden alterations in our way of living. So in facing these challenges, I hope that the past can draw from what Raymond Williams termed resources for hope that are embedded in the history of the IOE. Thank you.
Well, many thanks indeed to Tom for that wonderful introduction, and if I can take this opportunity to congratulate him on this excellent second edition. I invited Tom in the first place to take it on, and it's a fantastic achievement. Well done, Tom. Thank you. Of course, I'm old enough myself to remember the launch for the first edition, which was a grand occasion, very much in the spirit of the Institute. And I think there'll be a number of colleagues and former colleagues here who could probably remember that. So perhaps you want to put your hands up if you could remember that. Yes, there's a few people I can see, and perhaps if you're online, you might want to put your hands up as well. You know, the first edition was commissioned by the late Jeff Whitty, as Tom mentioned, as director. And I remember him calling for a new edition at Richard Aldridge's memorial event in 2015. And I know he'd be very pleased indeed to see this new project come to fruition, and also extremely proud that this has happened. These acts of remembering are important, I think, for our own development and for our identity as an institution. But the history also tells us other things. They remind us, of course, how our past has shaped our present. They tell us about the contribution that's been made more broadly, and often the problems, and about how much remains to be done. They're institutional, but also potentially interinstitutional, our relationships with our partner institutions over time. And also potentially not simply institutional, but social history, which I think we all want to aspire to. So the theme I've chosen for this very short talk today, I think, tries to speak to all of those things. If we were to try to design a family tree of our current department, which is hosting this today, Education, Practice and Society, we'd see in some kind of detail in the various manifestations of our departments over the last 50, 60, 70 years or more, the development of educational studies in particular detail. And in the early stages, present at the creation, as it were, was Fred Clark. Now, it's an apt coincidence, I think, that (2022) marks not only the 120th anniversary of the Institute of Education, London, but also the 70th anniversary of the death in January 1952 of one of its leading early directors, Sir Fred Clark. For contemporary educators such as Professor A.V. Judges of King's College London, Clark was the doyen of pedagogic leaders in his own country, a reformer through and through. And to former students like the historian Brian Simon, he was the leading educational statesman in Britain. It was Clark who presided over the early development of the Institute of Education under its new title at the University of London as its director from 1936 to 1945, through the challenges of the war years when the IOE was moved to a temporary home in Nottingham. Clark's role as a significant educational reformer during the Second World War has recently been established based on the influential book Education and Social Change. I have it here. It doesn't look like much, does it? But it's one of the key documents in the development of education as a study in this country. Education and Change, an English interpretation. and his position at the IOE, which gave him a platform to advocate wide-ranging educational reforms. Doctoral research at the IOE has demonstrated that Clarke helped to lead the educational debate through a large number of speeches and discussions through the country in the darkest days of the Second World War, carrying his speeches around the country, all over the country, and also that he was able to personally advise the President of the Board of Education, R.A. Butler. These discussions culminated in the Education Act of 1944, which formed the basis for extensive changes in the post-war education system, including secondary education for the whole age range of 15. After the war, Clarke was a champion of what he called the educative society of the future, and also the first chair of the Central Advisory Council for Education, created by the Education Act. This was a key advisory body that later produced such documents as the Crowther Report, the Newsom Report, Plowden Report, which is still familiar today. And Clarke led it to the publication of its first report, with the characteristic title for Clarke of School and Life in 1947. Nevertheless, Clarke's contribution as director of the Institute in establishing educational studies in its modern form at the IOE has, I think, often been underestimated. There already were a number of academic chairs in education at the IOE and elsewhere, but it was Clarke's singular achievement to establish them in specialist areas of education, which in his plan for the post-war developments of the IOE, he defined as philosophy, psychology, including social psychology, sociology, history, and comparative education. He argued that these were crucial for the widening scope of the study of education that were needed especially for the expanding secondary education and advanced and higher education, and indeed lifelong learning that he anticipated for the next half-century. He actually placed philosophy above the others, and Louis Arnaud Reid was appointed as first professor of the philosophy of education in 1947. Psychology was already well established in relation to educational issues, and Philip Vernon was appointed as professor in 1949. Sociology was strengthened through the presence, all too brief though it was, of Karl Mannheim. A chair in the history of education was initially established at King's College London, and he predicted, rightly, that it would come to relate more fully to social and economic history. And finally, provision for comparative education was of growing importance for the post-war world and in relation to new international institutions such as UNESCO, and Joseph Lowries became the first professor of comparative education in 1947. Meanwhile, there was no academic journal that covered education in general, but it was Clarke's ambition to establish such a journal towards the end of his career, culminating in 1952 in the creation of the British Journal of Educational Studies as the first national academic journal of education to be produced in this country, and still going strong. Clarke himself promoted a public discussion around education as an academic formation of knowledge, worthy of being studied in depth in its own right, and especially through his authorship of the first published critique of its kind, The Study of Education in England in 1943, another really key document, almost impossible to find, except, of course, at the Institute. Some of his trenchant verdicts on how education were regarded in England I'll reserve to a little bit later. But as well as these key contributions in helping to establish educational studies as an academic field, Clarke also led the first national survey of educational research in 1939. This began the creation of a network of collaboration between individuals and institutions committed to the study of education in some form, which could identify both the long-standing weaknesses and the potential strengths of educational studies and research in England and in Wales. The national survey led by Clarke at the Institute pointing as it did to the urgency of greater coordination in educational research, and to a relationship between a range of different organizations and types of research, were at least the first step in this long and apparently uncompleted journey. But I'll conclude this short talk today, and I think we can enjoy some of the comments that Clarke made in his work, The Study of Education in England. And it's important to remember that he made these while he was still Institute Director, really trenchant comments, very direct, pointed at the authorities in England, but also at public opinion, to change the status of education in England. One of my favourite quotes ever: "If we conducted our medical and engineering sciences and our industrial production with the same slipshod carelessness, the same disregard for precision of thought and language, the same wild and reckless play of sentimentality or class prejudice or material interest, masquerading as a principle with which we carry on our public discussions about education, most patients would die, most bridges would fall down, and most manufacturing concerns would go bankrupt." Wonderful. And in the same vein, the argument here is not simply that education has at least as much claim to systematic study as animal husbandry, or rural economy, or coal mining. It's something much more urgent and momentous than that. I think you can tell as well the beautiful prose of the man. And taking the future seriously means taking education seriously. Taking education seriously means the dropping of amateurism, sentimentality, and the queer kind of toadyism which equates the value of an utterance with the social prestige of its author. And finally, in the place of all such things, seriousness will bring the scientific temper to the service of social zeal and imaginative administration. So a celebration of Clarke today, but Clarke within the wider development of educational studies and of the Institute and of the ways in which it's made a contribution to the development of education in this country over the last 120 years. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Tom. So I'm going to move on to talk about something a little bit different now. I'm going to talk about students. We haven't heard a lot about students yet, and of course students are, to me, at the heart of any institution and should be at the heart of any institutional history. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a course that I teach. This is a course on, sorry, this way. I'm going to talk to you about a course that I teach here at IOE at UCL for our BA Education Studies degree. So this is our flagship degree at the Institute of Education, about 420 students a year. It's been running for the last decade. IOE, as you may know, is quite new to undergraduate education. But one of the things that we wanted to do on the BA Education Studies is create a course, a first-year course, that does three things. So it introduces students to history as a discipline, to the methodologies for researching history. Secondly, it introduces students to history of education as a sub-discipline of history, with a focus particularly on students and student life and higher education. And thirdly, it introduces students to our own institutions, to IOE and to UCL. It's aimed at students who are here for the first time. They are new to, in many cases, the UK, certainly new in many cases to London, and of course they're new to IOE and to UCL. So this is the aim of the course. It's taught in a really wonderful space on the UCL campus. So it's taught in the Object-Based Learning Lab, which is a brand new space that's been converted in the main part of UCL. So if you think of where the portico is and the columns that go up, it goes basically straight underneath the steps. This Object-Based Learning Lab used to be the old refectory. And it's very much designed to kind of have objects brought in for students to work with. I think it's important, if we're going to research and write institutional histories, that we also teach about those histories. And we teach about those histories with current students. And we invite those students to shape our understandings of our own institutional histories. And that we effectively are creating new histories through a course like this. So this is part of a kind of wider movement across a number of different universities to really think about institutional histories and to create new modules. So there's a number of really great examples of projects. There's a great course at SOAS, Colonial Curricula, which does very similar things. There's the Roehampton Campus Project. There's an interesting article about that you might want to read. The University of Alabama has a Hallowed Grounds project. There is sort of Uncomfortable Oxford, Uncomfortable Cambridge tours. So courses and projects that seek to challenge and upend established and understood histories, and particularly to ask quite difficult questions of those institutions, and to recognise that we can be both, you know, very much fond of and love an institution, but not afraid to ask those difficult questions about their evolutions and their stories. It is taught very much through kind of public history outputs. The students always read blogs, they listen to podcasts each week, they go on campus scavenger hunts and tours, they have visits to the museums, and they really kind of engage with the space and the place of the university. And I think that's really important because remember, this university, UCL itself, has been here for 200 years, the IOE in different sites around this part of London for 120 years. There's kind of institutional memory here, and there is memory you know, that we can think of as campus memories, and these are real students' lives that we study in this course. These were real people who were here 200 years ago in this space, and so we should be kind of thinking about the campus and how it's changed and developed over time. It covers a number of themes, so we kind of look through a number of themes around the myths around UCL itself, this idea of Jeremy Bentham as the founder or not the founder, the myths around the admission of women as kind of being on equal terms with men. That's a constant thing that UCL kind of likes to say. We think particularly about how institutions present those histories today to public audiences and how those have changed over time. How does IOE celebrating 120 years? They've chosen to do that. We've chosen to do that for a very particular reason at a particular moment. UCL is about to be celebrating 200 years, which is a hugely significant commemoration. We look really at sort of higher education in the context of empire, of the creation of the nation state in the 19th century, and it's linked with empire and empire building, particularly around the disciplines, the forms of knowledge, the ways in which we collect and know and understand things that happen in the world and how those are linked to the creation of disciplines, and how particularly through visiting museums and things, students get to understand kind of how colonial forms of knowledge are really embedded into academic disciplines and continue to be so today. So we think about decolonising universities, we think about asking these difficult questions, such as a question that I know my students are quite concerned about: why is there no space in this building named after a woman in our 120th year? We have tried, but it hasn't succeeded yet. So these are some of the kind of key topics that we look at. Particularly with IOE, this is a challenging thing because many of our students come to UCL, not necessarily to IOE, and they perhaps don't necessarily recognise that IOE has had its own 120-year history that is distinct and separate from the wider UCL. So I think that using objects and special collections is a really good way to connect students with this. So you can see in my images, I stand back so you can see these images, students trying on IOE gowns from the IOE archives and students examining IOE materials from the special collections. So object-based learning is a specific methodology that I use in order to kind of make these connections, make these real connections between students in the present day and students in the past. And one of the things I always like to do is to get students to really relate what they're learning to their own educational experiences. So they might draw classroom plans of their own kind of primary classroom, for example, when thinking about progressive education in the 1960s. And they might bring in objects relating to their own educational history when we're thinking about how these objects of student culture and campus life in the past connect. I put up a few quotes here about this kind of importance of object-based learning to the course. It's absolutely embedded into the course. And students really, really like it. They really kind of engage with it. They like touching, the kind of tangible nature of touching something and recognizing it has a history that is 100, 200 years. And they kind of like the way that it's a kind of mystery, that effectively you're given an object that you have to think about, what is this, what does it mean? Look at it really, really closely, examine it completely, and sort of hold it and touch it, or even wear it. So I do like using items of clothing. There's a couple more quotes here. students here playing with the wonderful collection of mini furniture that we have in the IOE archives, which is a collection of furniture from the David and Mary Mead archive, which the architects used to design classroom spaces, and students can design their own ideal classroom if they could come up with an ideal classroom. There's a couple more quotes that I won't kind of read out, but these are done after. This is from the module evaluation, and I've only just got a few of these so far, but they're questioning some of the really, really helpfully, having more time, having longer time to kind of do that. And there's a really nice quote here about being based in the main campus. The only time our students are based in the main campus on our program is in my module, and they really like that. They really kind of like the fact that they're there in the centre of UCL. So assessment. The students are assessed by two things. One is a public-facing blog, and the other is a public history project, in which students identify a topic, any topic in the history of IOE or UCL, and they work together to create a project, do some research. They use both primary sources with the archives, objects, and the space and place of the campus, and secondary sources. And they then take that research and turn it into a creative output to share what they found out about our own institutions with a wider audience. So we have things like games, websites, film, blogs. There's a few links here, a few kind of titles that come up. They are really, really, really creative and really insightful. And I'm just going to share one of those, a really quick film clip with you now.
I'm Sophia, and I, with my partner Barbara, are on a mission to make the history of the IOE more accessible to everyone with our project, Rome IOE. Our project focuses on Susan Isaacs and Dorothy Gardner, the two heads of the Department of Child Development for decades at the IOE, yet not much is known about them among current students. With our 6 objects, you'll be able to find out more about the women, their personal lives, and their legacy at the IOE. The first thing you need to do is download the app on the App or Google Play Store, and make sure that it's installed properly on your phone. Then, make sure to take a look at the map to find out where the objects are located. You want to look out for this logo to ensure that you found where the objects are located. Once you have the app and you know where the objects are, join me inside the IOE to come find out more. All you have to do is use the map to figure out where the objects are located in the IOE. For example, look, I found one here. Then what you want to do is open up the app and click on the AR scanner, and then on the ground plane icon in the bottom left of your screen. Once you project the logo into the app, you should be able to see the object. For example, the one that I've now scanned is a laboratory set to represent Susan Isaacs' experimental approach to learning. Then, if you click on the object, commentary should play, which will enable you to learn more about the object, its significance, and more about Susan Isaacs. The clanking of laboratory instruments and learning tools as children examined and inquired while learning defined Susan Isaacs' career. With this short instructional video, we hope you will find it fun to find the objects and explore the IOE, all while learning about 2 influential women in history. If you are in need of help or more information, make sure to check out our website. Have fun roaming the IOE!
So thank you very much to Sophia and Barbara for letting me share that with you. We'll move on. So just to kind of bring this together, the idea of the public history projects is to explore particular themes and topics, but it's also to develop skills. So skills of historical interpretation and analysis, but also skills of teamwork, of things like video production, podcast making. It's trying to do a lot of different things, this module. It's a very ambitious kind of module, and I think the students absolutely rise to the challenge, as you can see with that excerpt. What I really like about it is it places first-year students as researchers. They can contribute new things to our knowledge and understanding of these institutions. They can do that research. They can share that research with their peers, with wider audiences. And that, I think, is really kind of exciting and really important to put the students who are the university into the kind of creation of those university histories. So not merely, writing about them or writing essays about them, but creating history. And I just want to kind of bring this then to come full circle, really, in terms of my research into students, leads to my interest in teaching students about students, which then leads to my interest in doing more research about students. And I just want to introduce to you this project, Generation UCL. You've got a postcard on your chair. This is a really exciting new project in the run-up to UCL's bicentenary, placing students right back at the heart of the story of UCL as a university, but also of the merged institutions. So I think one way to understand IOE's history is of 120 years of student life in London. there's also 200 years of student life in London if you think about UCL, and there's also a number of other merged institutions that kind of fit into that picture, that they are, you know, in this area of Bloomsbury, a number of independent, formerly independent universities, colleges that are now part of UCL. So how do we tell UCL's history? We mustn't ignore those stories. We need to kind of bring them back in. And one way is by this unifying theme of students, and students as some people have been here in Bloomsbury for 200 years. Students in UCL invented what it was like to be a student in London in the 1820s. Okay, we were the first university in London. We kind of created that. There was Oxford, Cambridge, there was Scotland, but this was the first in London, the first significantly outside Oxford and Cambridge. So yeah, this project puts kind of students right at the heart of the project, and there's going to be lots of interesting activities. So do follow our website and look at our postcard to find out more. And I just want to end by saying thank you. It takes a village to raise a child, but it definitely takes a village to run a module like this. So thank you to all of these people, and thank you to my students. I've got students here all around the room, which is fantastic to see. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for listening.
So we now have some time for questions and answers, so I would like to invite the panelists to take their seats and then open up to everyone. So I'm going to start with a couple that I've just got in front of me, then we'll turn to the audience. I see you there, Martin. So the first question we have, and it's for the whole panel here, what steps is the IOE taking to address student questions around visible diversity reflected in the IOE? For example, there are no rooms here named after a woman. Now, there are other people in the room that we could turn to answer this question, but I think we'll start with the historians.
I mean, I can take that.
If you want to follow up from the
I honestly didn't plant that question, I promise. Yeah, I agree completely. I personally think, this is a personal opinion, I think that this wing has just been renamed after Whitty, Jeff Whitty, Whitty Wing, another white man. I do think that was a missed opportunity, it has to be said. I think that when you create new spaces on a campus, perhaps looking through other options, other kind of more diverse names from history would be good. I have had a number of years worth of correspondence with former directors, one of whom sitting here, about the idea of having this named after Margaret Punnett, the IOE's best director that we'd ever had, in my opinion. And I do think, yeah, I don't know, I'd like to say I think we should be naming spaces in different ways, because I do think it's important. I think it's that naming is political, and that naming spaces is a political act. And we are educating an enormously diverse cohort of students, and those students are not really reflected in the way in which this building is kind of framed and shaped, I don't think.
And I guess there's a wider perspective. There's a kind of a whole issue about how we recognise past staff and students, you know, in other ways as well. Rooms, that's right, on the website, on, you know, alumni, you know, notable alumni that a lot of universities have. I mean, how you frame that, what you do with that, kind of creates opportunities as well, I think, for. And I'm very sympathetic to and interested in looking at that, and we have had some discussions about that, but it could go much further and faster, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think there are real lessons we can learn from our history about ways in which we can develop our diversity, attempts which have been very important but not always totally successful, and trying to learn from those. I'm currently very interested in, for example, in the early development of the Centre for Intercultural Education in the late 1970s. Jagdish Gundra, the late, who was brought in from the then ILEA to really make a big effort to engage the IOE with the issues around ethnicity and culture, which were really very, very difficult in London and the broader society at the time. And a big investment was made. I think that it maybe wasn't as successful as it might have been, and there are various reasons for that. I think you need to put a lot of real investment into it, real effort to try to do this over the longer term, to make sure that it doesn't peter out into something or becomes simply an academic exercise. These things have been seen elsewhere as well. I think a specifically departmental culture can be difficult as well, which is why that was made into a centre. But then developing links between a centre and other departments, that in itself takes a lot of planning and a lot of investment. And I think, you know, those episodes in our history, we can learn from those. And I think currently there is a lot going on in UCL more broadly, I know, and within the Institute to try to develop diversity. And I do hope that those can be informed by the mixed record which we have as an institution.
Well, thank you. I might just add that those of you who are former students might notice that there have been some changes to the building. There are going to be further changes to the building. There is a master plan. We've been promised more than a facelift, I should say. So it'll be very interesting to see how that accompanies perhaps a response to some of the questions and challenges that, well, we've just been discussing. I'd like to take some questions. We'll go 1, 2, if that's okay.
Probably a question for Gary or for Tom. What would surprise Fred Clark most about the current iteration of the Institute of Education? Or if not that, what would he most dislike about the current iteration of the Institute of Education?
Wow, what a question. I guess I guess I should go first on that, having talked about Fred today. I think he'd be amazed and really enthused to see how successful it's been since he was director here. I think that's the first point of it. As I mentioned, he anticipated very, very clearly the ways in which educational studies would need to cater for the broader social changes and educational changes which were taking place in the 1940s. He got it pretty well right over the next little while. He also said that we would need to have more professors in as needs emerges and opportunity comes. And I guess having about 90 odd and counting now, I think you would probably see that as a success, and more broadly too. I think he'd be very interested to see the ways in which educational research has developed as a cohesive, unitary type of approach, as distinct from educational studies, and sometimes the tension that's developed there. And I think he would see that as moving on. He'd be delighted to see the development of BERA. There's no such thing as a national organisation for educational research at the time. And of course, he did the first national survey of educational research. So the UK was very, very late in developing that from the late 1970s. What would he be displeased, irritated by? That's a wonderful question. I think that he might still be irritated by a sense that education still isn't regarded as top table, just in the way that were in the 1930s and 1940s. The very direct ways in which he tried to produce a favourable public discourse and succeeded is very, very important in the post-war period. That public opinion was very strongly in favour of education. And I think education lost that towards the end of the 20th century. He'd have hated that. And I think that struggle continues. I think that's what he would be most disappointed with.
Thank you. So we have another question here.
Yes, just really a comment on what you were saying about object-based learning. And on the back of what you said about the building itself, that's the thing that you can't help, the object that you can't help but learn about, when you're a student here, which is the building itself. And by all means, there was, you know, architectural mayhem in the building of this building, and by Dennis Lasden, designed by Dennis Lasden, who also designed the National Theatre, which was a very long-lasting project, and also the Royal College of Physicians, which is a particularly beautiful building. But when I was a student here, sort of between 2009 and 2014, what I wanted to say is that I spent, as many students do, quite a bit of time sitting in the open area, which is confusingly on the 3rd floor, you know, as you enter from the plaza with the glass windows, which was particularly well lit. Now they've dropped the ceiling, like they have in here as well, to put lighting and other services in. But anyway, the point was that one day I met a gentleman who was a qualified architect whose job it was to go around the building and sort of look at various cracks and, you know, things that needed doing to maintain the building. And he had a really good knowledge of the building, its construction and so on. It's obvious that, that staff who work here were always finding difficulty with the single glazed windows and the temperature in their staff rooms and so on. And obviously buildings date in that way, but it was always nice, and this is obviously before the merger, this is why I'm making the point, that this building was looked after, it was thought of as an important structure in its own right, whatever the sort of contemporary problems with it might be. And it's a thing, an object in its own right, which as you use the building, as you study in it or teach in it, you can't help but learn about it. And that's the point I wanted to make about the building as an object.
Well, I might just add that shortly before I joined the IOE, I was watching John le Carré's Little Drummer Girl, I think it was a BBC series. And there was a huge explosion, I think on the 6th floor of this building, as depicted in this BBC series. And that was my welcome to the IOE in some respects. We've got a question here, and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I'm possibly suggesting a future line for your research, but I'm sorry. It may be a base that you've already covered. It's two interlinked questions. The first question is, how much is known in the student record and how much has it been researched in terms of the origins of students at the Institute, the shift from it being initially a metropolitan or civic organisation and attracting students from greater distances and then attracting students internationally. And just a question as to whether that's been done or whether it's a future line of inquiry. But going on beyond that, a more important question, it strikes me, is what diplomatic links are forged at student level in a place like this, which are significant in all kinds of unforeseen ways. If I can give an example which isn't from the Institute, I taught a student on a master's course at Birmingham years ago from Zimbabwe. He went and became a minister in Mugabe's first government and became world famous by throwing a shoe at a visiting American president. And people who've been on these master's courses and studied at doctoral level in places such as the Institute go on, in many cases, to have glittering and very significant careers. And is there a future line of research in terms of what is the oblique or indirect footprint of the Institute in terms of a global diplomatic links?
I think that's you.
Well, I think there's a lot of scope for that, Roy. Thank you. I know, I remember when our colleague Mark was working on a module, he noted that no one had seemed to noticed before that a Prime Minister of Nigeria had studied here, for instance. And it's those kinds of things that shouldn't necessarily come as sort of serendipitous surprises, that there is absolutely scope for that. I included a few quotes in the book from a international development student who'd been interviewed and similarly kind of made reports that strangely, sometimes just mention of the IOE for her seemed to open doors for her, and she got invites to various places. So there's absolutely scope to do that, I think. There's also lots of issues, I think, that need to be unpacked around, diversity in London and diversity in an international context that can mean quite different things and involve sometimes different students that perhaps is something internally for the Institute to think about further. But thank you for that. I mean, I'm sure there's lots we could develop on that.
I think there are tremendous opportunities in everything that Roy's just said there. We're blessed with having a really fantastic Institute archive, which I really strongly recommend to anybody who wants to do any research on higher education in this country. You must make an appointment at the Institute. It's got a superb online catalogue as well to start to get you into it. We of course now have an excellent key history, but I think that's just the first stage in developing understanding of a wide range of different aspects of our histories. Over the next generation, I'm confident that we'll have a lot more research, and I hope that many people coming here today will be enthused and want to think about that. And I'd be happy to talk to them about that.
Okay. We had a question here from what term?
Well, it's at several points, not necessarily a question. It's just about the like building on the kind of previous discussion on the origins of students. I just have one minor point is about not only students from the IOE specifically, but students from students from UCL have their I'm trying to raise a point specifically about Chinese student in the modern in the I think pre-1915 that era who have been studying in UCL, and I think one specific person who might be interesting would be Minister Chang Tao-fan, who used to be the minister for propaganda and artwork for the KMT administration in the Republican period. And that's just another quite interesting figure, probably might be interest for studying. And the other point is about the architectural image that we're just raising at the moment. It's just about the building's architectural modernism. While it may be characterized, it can be characterized as brutalist architecture, but it may be some sort of revised modernism architecture, which we might have seen some, not only see the kind of modernism on the facade, but also probably see the kind of some modernist underpinnings in some of the works that were conducted by the IOE in the post-war period. I'm specifically thinking of Richard Peters, whose analytic philosophy was kind of flourishing at the Institute at the time, and so that's maybe a kind of link maybe drawn if future works can be done in this area. And I think I have one final thought or kind of question about to raise. It's about Georgina's your project on the student experience. Is that are you specifically looking on the students' experience, or are you considering the intellectuals and probably politicians or technocrats that were involved around the Bloomsbury area in the historical period? Are these included in your project? Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, I can start with that. So yeah, thank you. Just in terms of Chinese students and international students, so my students are very interested in international students in the past. Many of them are international themselves, and what's fantastic about the archive, as I'm trying to explain, is that it's actually really hardly touched. certainly the UCLs, we have amazing records of individual students, and their past lives are kind of recounted and preserved, but actually, because of the way UCL's history has been done, so we had a 1929 sort of centenary history, Hail Bellow, and then there's a book which I updated a few years ago that was written in the 1970s, but there hasn't been anything else. I mean, we are literally trying to do this now from scratch, so all of these great stories from the records about students' lives and their future amazing careers in many fields needs to be done. And so the Generation UCL project, because of the kind of restraints of funding and timing, is focusing really on students. So we're collecting oral histories of students, alumni that are still alive, which is really important to do. There's never been a project looking at alumni voices from UCL, so that's really, really important. And then secondly, kind of archival sources. But of course, as and where those student lives interconnect with other things, particularly in Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury is a really important kind of area of London that's had these kind of connections. So yeah, absolutely, the kind of intellectual life of Bloomsbury fits into that, certainly, I would say.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up on Roy's question and points, but actually on a more local basis. When I was a young teacher working in the ILEA in the 1970s and 1980s, I remember a good number of colleagues coming here to do part-time MAs mainly. And that was very, very important. I mean, I'm aware, I think there are other people who would know this from the ILEA, but they were able to enrich discussions and practice in relation to curriculum, pedagogy, and they really, you know, I really felt that as a young teacher and as a, you know, when I had my early responsibilities. Now, my perception is that following the breakup of the ILEA, those kinds of opportunities, the funding, and also there were sabbaticals, and I think they all went. And I just wonder whether this has formed any part of research, or if it isn't, as Roy said, to flag it up for the future. Because I think in terms of the diversity, certainly when I in retirement came to do my PhD part-time, the people I spoke to who were studying here part-time, who were teachers, all of them, and it may simply have been the people I spoke to, they were all from independent schools, whereas I didn't meet anybody from our, you know, I talk of the wider locality of inner London, where we have so many schools in challenging circumstances and so many schools that could be enriched by colleagues having the opportunities that they once had here. Sorry, I've gone on. Thank you.
Well, the impact of the breakup of the ILEA is something which many people here in this room have experienced from different points of view, different positions within their professional lifetimes. You know, I know that some came to the Institute specifically after that. I think the relationship between the Institute of Education and IOE is, I agree, really very fascinating one, which hasn't yet found its history. I think if I get a bit of time, I'll do that, and I know the sorts of people I'd like to talk to about it as well. But it's a great question, and it's something else I'm going to say. You know, we've got a lot still to do. We've been talking so much today about the past, but this is also about our opportunities for the future as well, and how to use this as a base, as has been mentioned, with UCL bicentenary coming up. I think we've got to make a big contribution to that. But also I think that there are some very, very rich areas, such as you're talking about, which, you know, either we or our students or other colleagues, you know, there's great opportunities there.
Thank you. A question here, and then we'll come to you.
This is a question for Tom, but I think for Georgina as well. It's, I think, rare you get the opportunity to pick up a book that someone else has written and take the opportunity to revise it, add it, write it. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges or opportunities in picking up these institutional histories with a different author and writing a second edition for them?
I can try. To add to what I said, I mean, I guess it's obviously a bit problematic. I mean, I was quite glad, you know, Richard was kind of a liberal figure, I guess, who was very, he would have said he was, you know, he looked at the evidence and was kind of led by that a little bit, and which is not a bad thing to inherit in a way. You know, it wasn't like he came across with some kind of strong Foucauldian approach or something that, you know, which you might not with a institutional history in any case. So I kind of welcomed that in a way, because then I didn't have to think about headings. I mean, the thing that he did, the structure that he had, was he introduced every chapter with a kind of political context, the wider kind of parliamentary party political context. So I stuck with that and added, and obviously sometimes that overlaps with the international context. And then there were kind of certain categories that kind of suggested themselves. I certainly didn't try and sort of copy his style of writing, as it were. So maybe you can tell, maybe it's not seamless, but at the same time, that would be, I think that's a loser, you know, if you try and do that. If you were editing the whole thing in detail, then perhaps that might apply. And George could talk about that, because she has edited a much older book that had kind of dated a bit more than this book, which perhaps had not dated quite so much. I mean, you know, there are more debates now, I guess. You know, that might lead us to a discussion of things like, you know, decolonising the curriculum or internationalisation. You could potentially, and universities are now more willing to openly, partly because they've been pushed, but more openly consider these kinds of issues. And you could have, I guess, you know, if you had have edited, reworked the whole thing, you could have, there might have been issues around that you would draw out a little bit more. But other than that, they were the kind of key issues for me. And it was slightly easier than, say, that would lead on to George, who had perhaps, you know, had an issue.
So I did the 4th edition of a book that had 3 previous editions. And I didn't do all the research again, but I definitely went through it and pretty much, in many cases, did a lot of editing and rewriting and changed a lot of the problematic content, partly because I wasn't willing to put my name on that book until I'd done that. I wouldn't have added a chapter. They did originally ask me to add a chapter, and I didn't want to do that because it was too problematic to do that. So I think that was a very different situation. The book was originally written in the late 1970s, subsequently updated in 1990 and 2004, but each time they didn't go back and change any of the first bit, so it really was a 1970s kind of version of a history. And in fact, the scholars that wrote it, I mean, I think they will admit that they took a lot from the 1929 history of UCL, which is why we're absolutely desperate for a new history of UCL, because there really hasn't been a really refreshed kind of take look for, you know, almost 100 years. So that's why, you know, and which is, it is, I mean, I do say this, UCL as a hugely important university is really, really under-researched compared to other universities in the UK and indeed internationally. So yeah, so it was an interesting challenge, and I kind of think I improved it a bit, but it certainly, you know, needs a new. And we did a lot of nice design work on that book. I'm talking about the Worlds of UCL, which is also UCL Press, freely downloadable, but it's much nicer in print because it's really a coffee table book. It's got a lot of nice pictures, so it's much better. It kind of feels much nicer to hold.
Yeah, yeah. If I can just add to that as well, I think we shouldn't underestimate how difficult a task it is to do a really good history of your own higher education institution. Any institution such as this has got its own sensitivities, let's say, which a historian of the institution is really, they've got to not shy away from them, but they've got to be very careful because they can easily offend people who are working there still and who will be reading it very avidly. And I remember very clearly Richard Aldridge, who was an extremely careful and fastidious scholar. And he took a long time to get the phrasing just right when he was looking at particular issues and particular personalities, including some of the most powerful personalities in the Institute. And he talked to me a little bit about that. He did a marvellous job, but I think that some carried on in that state. You know, some university histories actually don't try to do the last 30 years. But this one has done it, and it's done it fantastically well. So I think we should all be applauding that.
Great question. Now we've got a question over there. I
think Elaine had a hand up as well earlier.
Sorry, yes, we've got questions from two EID colleagues, but I saw Moses first.
I think I can speak from here, or I could use this. I don't know whether it makes a difference. But thank you so much. I've just learned a lot about listening, just a little story about where the IOE journey has been from. And my question actually builds a bit on what Martin did ask. It must be tough. I think Gary has tried to answer it, writing this sort of book, balancing between the impact of the institution and telling the narrative about the institution. The question I wanted to ask, and I've been sensitive to ask it, I think, was to say, what did you find uncomfortable in the history of IOE as you tried to update the book? It's a bit of a sensitive question to ask, but I can imagine within all these nice parts of IOE, there are also very uncomfortable bits of the history that you uncovered as you did the research. But you don't have to answer me. I think, as I said, it can be quite sensitive. Thank you.
Do you want to answer?
I mean, I guess just I'm trying to think now. I mean, the obvious things that that we discussed, that we have discussed at the Institute, are around, obviously, people like Cyril Burton, his role in eugenics, you know, the issues around that I know our international development colleagues such as yourself are very aware of, you know, that the whole international development work, you know, started off in a colonial context. And it's not that doesn't mean to say you wouldn't do it. It's just that, but that would raise a whole set of issues. For me, there was just one more specific recent one is around, you know, when I was talking about the kind of space and place of the Institute. That, for instance, in the early 2000s, I think the Institute perhaps it emphasised that it was a very diverse place. But it was doing that partly on the back of kind of international students who might be from very kind of privileged backgrounds in other countries and perhaps were not fully thinking about how they might engage with those issues locally as well as internationally. And so it's that kind of, I was trying to indicate, I guess, about the complexity of the space and place issue in relation to kind of inequalities and how, and as I've obviously, you know, an elite type institution, you know, how you then engage with that creates all sorts of problems and issues.
We can bring in, we've got two questions over here. So, microphone's next to you.
Thanks, and thanks for the presentations. I guess I wanted to push the point Moses is asking a bit further, and I know you've all said it implicitly, but I'd like maybe for you to think about it, to comment on it a bit more explicitly, because the title is sort of saying there was this growth from the training college to a global institution. But right from the foundation, there was a colonial department and there was an involvement with colonial history. And there was an involvement with, and I think this is very interesting, the colonial projects of LSE and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And it's that kind of interface, I guess, between the training college. I think the question about the ILEA really brings it out as well. London's a very particular kind of city. It's involved both with its own local education dynamics as well as a global city. And Fred Clark so exemplifies that, Gary. And I know you didn't tell his whole life, but you might, well, you know, he's engaged with colonial projects around modernization. And I think we've just got to name it and then try to understand what it is. And maybe the global, you know, it's from a global training, it was a form of global training college, and it's changed into a different kind of global institution. So just, yeah, maybe hear your thoughts on those points.
Before you respond, can we just take one more question just next to you?
Thank you very much. I don't know whether this is just a personal trend that I've experienced, but when I first came to the Institute of Education a long time ago now, very much subject studies were sort of tips for how to teach. I remember it very clearly. You were methods teachers. And now I think there's been a massive change in terms of recognising my subject happens to be mathematics, in terms of mathematics or science or English, and you've had very notable professors in those areas who've actually raised the whole status of teaching and learning in a knowledge area, I mean, a subject discipline. And I think that this has been a great strength of the Institute doing that, and I very much hope that that will continue in many ways. And it's not just subjects, I mean, it's obviously in assessment and statistical methods and other things. But the bit I was interested in was the fact, I remember so clearly when I came here, if you are interested in maths teaching as I was, it was just so know how tips of teachers you write on the blackboard properly. And now there's a whole area of research and endeavour in that area that I think this institute has led.
Thank you. So, okay, these were the last two questions and comments addressing issues of basically naming the colonial histories that we are attached to, and the fact that there has been a shift away from subject studies.
Well, I've talked a lot today about Clark, but just to add to that, I've written elsewhere about his role in internationalisation of studies and research and education. And I didn't mention, as I should have done today, if I'd had more time, the fact that when he was director, he was also advisor for overseas students. And after he stepped down as director, he kept that role going for the last 5 years of his life. That was a really key part of his role, it seemed to him. And so that was from the 1930s onwards. And I think earlier than that as well, I think, as Elaine's rightly saying, that there's also a history there which we can bring out. So thanks, Elaine, for that.
I absolutely endorse what Elaine said, and just kind of agree that there's perhaps more, a lot more scope to think about that. I think it's kind of, in the past it's difficult, isn't it? It's like peeling an onion. It's kind of been named and then left, but then you realise, oh no, you've got to go peel another layer off and name it again and rename it, and I think we're on a collective process of doing that really, and we don't quite know where that journey is going to end, but there is some importance in it. I mean, I'd be interested to discuss that further really, that precise point you're raising about how it is a fascinating kind of history, isn't it, about how the kind of colonial work shifts at some point into international development work, and I think there's a absolutely fascinating kind of work to be done, and work has been done in the past. There's a lovely kind of web set of resources on this if people are interested. And then, sorry, Celia's point as well, I mean, you can maybe come in on that, it is welcome too, and I think it's hard to say really. I mean, sometimes I guess in the 60s, 70s, people like Bernstein or Peters, I guess, would have started from kind of teaching situations in developing their work, and I think you're right though in terms of the development and where it's gone. It's probably not gone far enough. I know Becky was keen on this, that people doing teacher training should have a role in research, and there is a kind of interest in that now as well. I think that's continuing, that interest, because it's perhaps one of the unique features of the IOE that it carries out teacher training at scale, as well as being a significant centre for research. How you connect those up, I think the Institute has not done enough on that, and I know it's one of the priorities at the moment to be thinking about that. That's fine. Need to close shortly, Tom. Telling me to shut up. That's fine.
I was just going to say one thing about the colonial. The colonial is absolutely centre to my teaching on the histories both of UCL and IOE, and that kind of students look at the records of the colonial department, they physically get out the things, and they look through, the curriculum. What are students actually being trained to do? What is the perception of educators in London about what these students will need when they go to the colonies in order to kind of undertake the work that they'll be doing there? And we discuss, and we kind of discuss that. And so there's that, but there's also the ways in which you and colleagues are actually thinking about those histories, which is as much my interest in what is the history is also how do we present those histories? Why is it now in 2021, 2022, we're actually finally interested in those histories and we've got, you know, interesting projects and websites around them. So that to me is as, you know, the history of our institutions is as interesting to me and to my students, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to need to wrap up this section now, but I would just like to encourage you, please, to just grab a drink and come back because we are going to have a book launch in about 20 minutes. But with that, I would just like to thank the panel for this wonderful, this rich discussion about our history and future, indeed. Yeah. And thank you all.
I'm Professor Li Wei. I'm the Director and Dean of the IOE. Really pleased to welcome you to this wonderful event. I'm not going to repeat what's been said in the seminar, but this is the book launch part of our event. I should say that there aren't copies of the book for you to take, but it is actually freely available online. It's an open access book published by the wonderful UCL Press, which is one of the very few open access book presses in the world. So you can read it and download it at any time you like, and it's all free. I'd like to echo Brad's earlier remarks. And thanks and congratulations to Tom in particular for his excellent updating of Richard's wonderful book. Given IOE's role within the education system and within education research, the book really provides a valuable resource for many audiences. Of course, it is also a very important resource for the IOE, and in particular, I think it should be mandatory reading for any new directors. I'm very happy to see several of my predecessors. Peter is here, and of course Andrew is also here. Online we had Chris Husbands and Sue Rogers, but I really want to mention one person in particular, and that is my more immediate predecessor and the first female director and dean of the IOE, Becky Francis. Welcome, Becky. It's wonderful that all of you are able to join us today. We mentioned the naming of buildings. I don't know when that tradition started, but we certainly can look into changing that. Personally, I don't think we should name buildings after people, after individuals. I think there's also a kind of tradition of naming buildings after dead people rather than live people. But anyway, there is a plan to name the drama studio after the first female member of staff of the IOE, that's Margaret Punnett. And I think immediately follow her, there was another female professor here. I think she was called Clotilda von Weiss, I think. Yeah. Oh, well, Tom can correct me there. But certainly we should look at the contributions of our female staff. We do have more female colleagues in the IOE at all levels than male staff now. So that's a wonderful development. For me, and certainly my immediate predecessors, there are so many aspects of IOE's history that resonate across the decades. Just a year into this role as director, it's no surprise to me that the battle for space is a recurring theme. Then there are also ebbs and flows in the balance of IOE's work, from the psychological learning of Percy Nunn as director of the IOE's opening decades to Fred Clark's assertion of the sociological perspectives from the late 1940s to the more recent growth in IOE's work in social research, all mentioned previously by our speakers, and the arts and humanities and technology and AI all happening in the IOE today. That has been amidst some remarkable structural shifts from a hub to some 30 trainee teachers or teacher education colleges to international research powerhouse, which IOE really is. From a specialist institution to a faculty within UCL, one of the largest universities and multi-faculty universities in the world, to which the IOE adds its own world-leading status. As we celebrate IOE's 120th anniversary, we're both looking back at that journey and the shape, but also shaping the next phase. Once again, building works will feature, and we have a state master plan that will be implemented in the next few months. But so too will an expansion of IOE's work in intercultural understanding, climate change education, education technology, and communications. In each case, tackling the major educational and societal challenges of our age. Alongside, our programs will develop the transformative leaders we will need in education and beyond to build a just and inclusive society. Now, I'm looking forward to being interviewed for the next update of Richard's and Tom's book. I hope I will get a chance to be interviewed. In the meantime, let us hear a bit more from Tom, but also from our very special guest, Professor Wendy Robinson, on the latest edition. Tom has been introduced to you already. Professor Robinson is Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education at Lancaster University. She's a leading historian of education, and her academic specialism is in the history of the teaching profession. So very apt given IOE's roots. But more importantly, perhaps, Wendy is an IOE graduate who studied here in the early 90s. Wendy was a master's student here and studied history of education with Richard, in fact. So we're really delighted to have both of you here, especially Wendy, to join us. Over to you, Tom, first.
Okay, thank you. I won't take long this time. You've already heard from me. And I'd like to thank Li Wei in particular for embracing, for his interest in this historical project, for embracing the whole 120 years and giving the Institute a chance to use this book as one means to reflect on its past, but then obviously its present and future as well. So that's very welcome. Thank you. I'm going to thank a few other people, avoiding kind of obvious references to the Oscars, but I've said it now, you know. But Richard's family have been very supportive of this project, and it was really good to have that as a kind of moral backdrop, if you like, for the project, that they were keen to see this through, that they didn't see it as kind of in aspic, you know, that centenary book, that they thought, yes, we can take that forward, and that's very welcome too. Others were very supportive of people who have passed. Marilyn Toft, Jeff Whitty's partner, also a great support for this project. In Richard's family in particular, Avril, Simon and others were particular supporters. I'd like to thank, of course, the wonderful International Centre for Historical Research in Education and the great staff there who are wonderful colleagues who are doing original kind of historical research, developing new issues and problems relating to the history of education in its very widest sense. And we'd always like to hear from more people who might be interested in partnerships or other projects. But this book, very much I see it as coming out of that context, that culture of ICRI. And then finally, thank you as well to many people who are here. Thank you for coming, obviously, but the people who I spoke to in particular about aspects of the Institute's past. And that was a very interesting process. It was a little bit arbitrary, didn't speak to everybody inevitably, but and then I often had to check things with people. And Gary spoke about the problems of you know, keeping everyone happy, or which you can't do, it's an impossible task, but attempting to address the various conflicting issues. And I noticed when I asked people, what do you think to this bit I've written, you know, and usually I wouldn't give them too much because I knew they might come back with things I didn't want them to, on things that's kind of roughly related but not quite. And but they would come back with quite detailed comments. No, that happened slightly before, you need a comma there. And so there was quite an intricate process. But what it reflected, excuse me, what it reflected overall was the commitment and passion and interest that people had in this place, which really shone through. And then, I mean, finally, the you know, the purpose of the Institute to carry out teaching research, you know, on education and social research in its broadest sense, and to do that well and to be kind of world leading in some sense, but also to address issues of social justice and you know, that whole vision is one that's really worth defending, I think. It's you know, in the whole world around us that changes so fast, it's part of the challenge is to not just respond to those changes, but to identify the continuities. And Richard was very keen on this. You know, he always saw the purpose, the core role of the historian as to challenge, to chart, to understand, to assess and analyse not just the changes but also the continuities. And this is one of the modern kind of issues, one of the modern problems. You know, recently I heard in the Northern Ireland elections, the newsreader says everything changes but everything stays the same. You know, you could go back to many different contexts. Similarly in you know, the Italian unification, I came at, you know, the Tommaso di Lampedusa's book on the leopard, you know, everything changes and everything can stay the same. He says in that, crucially, it's a very different context. They're talking about the kind of mafia. You know, our purpose here, though, is very, very clear. You know, we know what we want to do, but defending that vision and keeping it going, yeah, and making space for it and understanding and making space in which the kind of contradictions and arguments that we might have can be contained in a productive way, I think is the crucial thing that we need to keep hold of. So thank you. I'll stop there and pass it over to Wendy. Back to the wine.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Professor Wave, for your very warm introduction. It really is an honour and a delight to have been invited to be part of today's special commemorative event to celebrate the history of the Institute, Tom's new edition of the book, and the key role of ICRE and the Department of Education, Practice and Society in this magnificent story. Gary asked me to say a few words about my memories of being a student here, which is exactly some 30 years ago when I studied for a one-year full-time MA in the history of education with the dear late Richard Aldridge. Arguably a real leader in the field and a great catalyst for the way the discipline has developed. First, I think it's fair to say that I had the most fantastic and thorough training and grounding in the art, craft and science of being a historian of education. On my first day on the course, Richard took me over to the old British Library, signed me up and showed me the ropes and said I had to be in here very, very regularly. Soon after, he took me to the then Greater London Record Office, now the London Metropolitan Archives, also showing me the ropes, showing me how to use the old card index system, which is not there anymore. And I then spent many hours, happy hours, researching the girls' higher grade schools, which was the basis of my thesis. This very practical training, alongside a very rich programme of lectures, tutorials, was highly personalised and immersive, and I think was a true gift, which only when you look back on it, you really appreciate it. My very first essay that I wrote
on Thomas Lecure and the Sunday School movement came back with a very dispiriting peppering of red ink and disparaging comments from Richard. There were lots of tears and I almost nearly gave up. But it was tough love, and that began an aligned training in academic writing. And I was thinking about, Tom, what you were saying about, and Gary, about Richard's approach. He was a real stickler, and I'd been schooled in a local comp in the 70s and 80s where there wasn't much teaching of grammar. Suffice it to say that with much editing and refinement and a lot of patience on Richard's part, this essay became my first ever published article in the History of Education Bulletin. Ever since, and even now when I'm writing academically, I always have this little image of Richard in the background with his beady eye on flow, structure and syntax. It was also helped by Roy, who's also here, who was also a real kind of mentor in my early career, and I think has the claim to being, having examined externally all 3 of my degrees. But he also, what with Richard on one side and Roy on the other, and Phil Gardner, who was my PhD supervisor. It was a wonder I ever got anything written at all. During this year, I was involved in the excellent History of Education seminar series that used to take place over the road in the IHR. This tradition is being continued by ICRE, and I think it's a really important part of the knowledge exchange and community building around history of education, led by the Institute and led by colleagues in the Institute. I met Brian Simon in one of these events for the first time. I was absolutely in awe of it. We were actually in the lift here in the Institute, and Brian said to me, "What are you studying?" And I said, "Girls' higher grade schools." And he said, "Well, there weren't any." I said, "Well, that's a story to be told." I remember hearing Raphael Samuel at that series, Marina Warner, and Tom, you mentioned Michael Barber and the Avalanche is Coming, but he used to come along to those when he was working for the NUT and join us in the bar afterwards for the post-seminar catch-ups. It was a fabulous year for me, rich, generous, rigorous, with a thorough grounding in the field and a set of learning and development opportunities that I think really did set me up for my future career in the various roles that I've had in different institutions. Richard and many other colleagues I met at the time through the seminars, other events. London became a bit of a hub for the History of Education Society, where Roy was a president, Gary's been a president, Richard was a president. And so I've got really, really fond memories of this place as a place, not just when I was a student, but subsequently as well. And I'm really, really proud to be an alumnus here. Second, I'd like to say a few words about the key distinctive role of the study of history of education that's been touched on already this evening as part of the Institute's history and growth. As we've heard from Tom and Gary and Georgina in today's seminar, the history of the Institute is in itself a great emblem for the history of teacher education, professional development and learning. It was great to hear from former teachers here. And the way in which education as an area of research, as a field of research, has developed and influenced policy over the last 120 years. My own work over the years in the archives, represented in my Power to Teach book and my Learning Profession book, gives a small taste of this. Now, in the old days, in the early 90s, in order to get into the archives, you had to be escorted down into the basement of the library, where they would then lock you in with a desk and a phone and give you sort of some kind of roaming access, because the things weren't properly catalogued then. Things have changed a long way, and you had to phone if you got into a panic or you wanted to be let out. Thankfully, things have got better. But in the work that I've done, I looked at the origins of the Institute in the London Day Training College, featured on the work I did on Masters and Mistresses of Method, and I'm quite keen that Florence Jessie Davis, who was the Mistress of Method here between 1909 and 12, might be somehow acknowledged whenever we do a wall of acknowledgement, but there are obviously lots of people that need to go on to that. I was really interested in the way that the work here in the Institute, or then the London Day Training College, almost became like the epicentre for a network of teacher educators, people that became principals of training colleges or then became professors of education, leading the study of pedagogy, leading the kind of development of educational research. Really fascinating. I looked at the work of Dorothy Gardner and the Centre for Child Development in the work I did on teacher professional development, particularly interested in the courses that were put on for training teachers and the sabbaticals that were put on in the sort of 50s and 60s. And then later in the 70s, I looked at the papers of Harry Reeves and the teacher centres. These are just some very few examples. And I think that what Tom does in the book and what Richard did in the book is highlight the very leading edge nature of what was then the Institute in its impact on the profession, on the development of policy and on the growth of research and understanding, which I think continues now as part of the bigger UCL family and as is reflected in its unrivalled position since 2014 as first in the QS World Rankings. Finally, to close, I'd like to think about the future and echoing Richard's kind of training, really. You think about the past to understand the present and to think about the future. Looking back at my own experience has been a bit of fun today, and also reflecting on the significance of the history of the Institute. And I think the key role of a sustained record of leadership and expertise in the history of education over the years. Richard was a really key figure from the 70s, 80s and 90s, but there have been other people, and Gary as the inaugural Brian Simon Chair in the History of Education, and then the fantastic strong team that we've had represented here tonight of real academic researchers and scholars to be found in Tom and Georgina and Mark. It's possible to see a great future ahead for the field within the Institute, building on the powerful legacy and heritage that has grown over the years. I do remember Richard talking to me about the preparation he was doing for the initial edition of what has been referred to, and I think Gary coined the term originally when he wrote Richard's obituary, this magisterial first edition of the history. I think Richard would be delighted with what Tom has now done with the second edition and also the future that lies ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Tom. I think it's time for us to have a toast. I know, take your in your own time. I know not everybody has a glass. To the wonderful book of the history of the IOE and to the future of IOE. To the IOE.